Great. Good morning, everybody. Guessing my mic's on because I haven't seen anybody tell me it's not. But again, my name is Eli Harland. I work at the California Energy Commission. I manage a team that is working on offshore renewables. So that's mostly offshore wind. We have some wave and tidal work that we do as well. But some of our key work is around the AB 209 grants for waterfront facilities that we've heard about throughout the week. We also are responsible for implementing Proposition 4. Importantly, we're also the team that will be working on the reports that are required in Assembly Bill 3. So the group that we have today on our panel, these are all experts in their space that are working on all those things at the port level. And so we'll hear a discussion today that covers a lot of those topics that are happening in my group. And I think before we get too far, just wanted to announce a save the date. On June 18th, the Energy Commission is going to be hosting a workshop to kick off the Assembly Bill 3 process. So save that date. It's going to be a remote access only workshop, so you don't have to make plans to be in person anywhere. And an official workshop notice will post when that comes out. So real quickly, I'm going to do an introduction for our panelists so that we don't have to take all the time on intros, but we're joined up here by Brian Sabina, who is the CEO of Clean Energy Terminals. Rob Holmlund, who is the development director at the Port of Humboldt. Suzanne, don't need to do an introduction. We all have met Suzanne this week. And Jennifer Lim, who is an engineer and project manager with Moffatt and Nichol. So we're going to get going with a series of questions. We're going to follow a Q&A format similar to the other panels that we've seen this week. And so really the first question is to get warmed up and orient around the projects that this team is working closely on. And so I would love to hear an update from each of you on the projects that are happening at your ports or in your regions. And if you can also touch on how the Assembly Bill 209 or the waterfront facility grants are supporting your work. I'd love to start with Rob and Suzanne because we did hear a lot about what's happening at the Port of Humboldt. We've heard a lot about what's happening at the Port of Long Beach, so maybe if you can touch on those quickly. And then we'll spend a little bit of extra time learning about the project Clean Energy Terminals and Moffatt and Nichol are supporting. So pass it over to you, Rob, and then we'll go to Suzanne.
Thanks, Eli, and thanks to all of you. It's an honor to be here. If I was to summarize the Humboldt Bay Heavy Lift Marine Terminal project, my short message is that everything's going really well. A lot of technical studies underway, an incredible amount of community engagement. CEQA, NEPA permits are all proceeding well. Thanks to the grants from the state and federal governments, we are now effectively fully funded for all the soft costs and heading into a schedule for construction, still figuring out what the optimal time for that is. But my short message is that everything's really proceeding well, and it seems that money attracts money, and so with each grant it makes it easier to get to the next, where we are now at the point where, thanks to the Waterfront Facility Improvement Program, we're funded to get this thing shovel ready.
Yeah, and I'll just say, very similar to Rob's update, it's been a very busy year for us at the Port of Long Beach on the Pure Wind project, progressing the technical design and really the environmental review process and supporting that with the technical studies as well. So we've made quite a bit of progress this past year. With the Notice of Proposed Award under the AB 209, that's really going to kick off a really intensive next phase of work for us next year with the next wave of our design development and finishing out our environmental review and permitting process. The other thing this last year is we've done extensive community engagement and outreach, setting up dedicated forums with a lot of interested parties to really talk through some of those key issues and provide us feedback that's going to inform what we're doing now and in those next phases of our development.
Oh, that's really helpful to hear, and the progress towards shovel ready is, I think, a word I heard both of you say. So, Brian, would love to hear about clean energy terminals and your project.
Sure, and thanks, Eli, for hosting us, and thanks to the whole Offshore Wind California team. Adam and Alejandra and Wendy and Garth. In times that are tough, fellowship and in-person engagement often matters. I know I've been getting a lot of benefit from being in this room and outside. For those who don't know me, Brian, Sabina, I lead Clean Energy Terminals. We're a California-based, private equity-backed port investor, developer. We tend to focus on projects that are a little bit on the smaller scale compared to the large stage integration terminals that Rob and Suzanne are working on, multi-tenant O&M terminals, lay-down facilities. Last August, we entered into a multi-year partnership with the Port of St. Louis, so the Harbor District there, to look at a multi-tenant O&M facility in San Luis Bay. I do want to recognize Commissioner Vesely is here, as well as a number of partners from the Central Coast team. Susan Strachan from the county is here, Susie Watkins. There's a number of folks, Josh Boswell, who have been great partners on that project over the last 9 months or so. For folks who may be asking, why are we working on O&M so early? I think there's a reality that it's as soon as you pull a turbine that's fully integrated off of Rob or Suzanne's quayside and you start towing it out to sea, you're going to have to start to maintain it. That's a pretty expensive piece of kit. And that means you need to have vessels that are out there to help in field commission that and start to maintain that asset. And those vessels need a home port. So offshore wind O&M ports are existential, are critical to the deployment of offshore wind, similar to the way that staging integration terminals are. And if you're building an O&M port right next to a staging integration port, maybe you can get away with waiting a little bit longer. But if you're doing it in a different location, we face many of the same community engagement, many of the same permitting, design, financing challenges that a larger port would. So that's where we're working on it right now. For folks who don't necessarily know where Port San Luis is, it's not the largest harbor in the state. It's about 3.5 miles north, 3.5 hours north of LA and about 3.5 hours south of San Francisco. So right in the middle of the coast, about 10 miles away from San Luis Obispo. And one of the reasons that we really believe in this project for an O&M terminal, I guess there's kind of two main reasons. One is a technical set of questions, and the other is kind of a community-centric development set of considerations. On the technical side, Port St. Louis is about 40 nautical miles from the offshore wind lease areas. So it's about a 4-hour steam if you use the 10 knot speed restriction in marine sanctuaries that are around that area. The next closest viable alternative, which would either be in the bay or down at Port Hueneme, is 160 nautical miles. So it is 4 times as far away, which means that it's something like 12 extra hours of steaming distance to get to those other locations. That may not sound like a lot for one trip, but if you have to do that 26 to 30 times a year, times each way, times 25 years of owning an asset, that adds up. Time to turbines matters in the O&M game. So I don't mean when we get steel in the water, I mean how close it is from leaving the quayside to when you get those technicians into the field. So we believe it in the natural location. It's a naturally deep harbor. It has lots of space. Vessels, modern SOVs can turn without impacting other ocean users and without lots of other dredge requirements. There's existing infrastructure in Port St. Louis. So there's existing piers, but importantly, there's also an existing federal breakwater that provides 98+% uptime for the facilities we're looking at. So it's actually quite a protected harbor there. And finally, it has a history on the technical side. It has a history of being a commercial port. A lot of folks don't think about that in the Central Coast, but Port St. Louis was the major import-export facility for the Central Coast from its inception. It was, at one point, the world's largest oil export facility in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It has a history of supporting energy projects. Many of the components that support the nuclear power plant in Diablo came through Port St. Louis. So this facility has a history of supporting commerce and industry, and specifically the energy industry. And we think it makes a lot of sense to bring that back in. I think the last thing I'll say is just on the community-centric development, we believe a lot that if you're going to build infrastructure, it makes a lot of sense to have a connection to the community that you're building in. In offshore wind, often that connection is through a port. And Jen and the team, you, Eli, did some great work with the AB 205 ports readiness, where we realized pretty quickly we're not going to put a staging integration terminal in the Central Coast. We're not going to put manufacturing. We're not going to put laydown. So O&M is really the primary way for that region of the state to have a long-term jobs-based connection into this industry. We think that's really important, and that's why we're so excited about the project. What's new, which was kind of your question, and thanks for indulging me as we kind of went on that tour of Port St. Louis and why. We've been doing technical work. We've obviously been doing some early community engagement. We just extended our agreement with the Harbor District in light of some of the federal policy uncertainties that we're seeing. The county actually has an ongoing study as well, looking at some different options. We're kind of sequencing our work to follow that work, and then we'll move forward with some technical and community work to move beyond that. The AB 209 money will help us push, if the Harbor District deems it's feasible, we want to move forward into detailed design and permitting, just like the two projects to my left.
Cool. Thanks for that overview, Brian. I have a good picture now of what's happening there and sort of the plans. And I want to come back to one of your statements there in a bit. But Jen, I know you're not specifically from a port, but you are supporting many ports and you're in your work. So if you could talk about how that work related to AB 525, but I think really those ports that are being recommended for AB 209 awards.
Yeah, thank you. So in addition to, Port of Long Beach, Port of Humboldt, and Port San Luis that were identified in AB 525, as part of the multi-port strategy, many other ports were identified. And I think the next stage is kind of to rein in or hone in on what are the additional ports needed for, say, manufacturing. And so with AB 209, some other ports were named as prospective winners, such as the Port of Richmond and Port of Oakland. And so with that funding, they'll be able to start their own conceptual studies and preliminary engineering to assess some of their own facilities and see how they can be used for offshore wind and what type of, what specific sites they could use for potentially manufacturing, and also what upgrades are needed for their port development. So, AB 209 is giving a chance for other ports to get involved with the offshore wind industry and be prepared for California's deployment. So, yeah.
Cool. That's helpful. So yeah, we have a group of projects that are really in that planning phase still, in that design phase. Haven't pulled the trigger or pulled the parachute out on going right into development, but we're really talking about engineering, design, environmental considerations, permitting at this point. So. Okay, so now we have the background. I wanted to ask a question and hear your perspective sort of on any comments you can make on changes that have happened at the federal level in terms of policy and how that could be impacting investor willingness to invest into port upgrades. But I think more importantly, with that comment, if you could also build out on any ideas you might have or any suggestions or things you're thinking about that the state and ports can do to sort of ease that uncertainty or to kind of continue the progress. So, Brian, I'll start with you, and then I think we can just move right down.
Sure. So maybe we set the stage before November. So it wasn't all sunshine and roses pre-election. I think if you look at the pool of capital and the pool of investors who is willing to take development and construction risk for offshore wind ports, it was actually a fairly limited pool. I think they were looking at things like project viability, supply chain delays, and already saying pre a lot of the things that have happened since November, hey, this is a risky market, right? So I think that was our starting point. Obviously, at that point, the conversations were more around when and not if. I think post January 20th, and certainly after the halt work order, stop work order, there's been a pretty markedly chilled investor sentiment, I would say, for offshore wind port investment. But that's gotten a little bit better with the stop work order being lifted. But really, the current policies create a ton of uncertainty that, in fact, impact different investors in different ways. So we're a private equity-backed investor. We have a relatively understood timeline in our minds of when we want to see projects progress from development stage into construction stage, and this uncertainty is shifting those projects to the right. And we risk basically those projects shifting beyond the window that we're comfortable starting investments on. So I think that's kind of one reality. I think the other is, we often hear about, well, can't we just take no regrets moves? Well, things that were no regrets moves 6 months ago may be completely off the table now. An example is we were doing some work that tied to tax credit eligibility for the site we're working on. That in 2 weeks, that tax credit may not be a thing anymore. So I think in this circumstance, it is quite hard for us to progress forward. Now that conversation is, I would say, different between the East Coast and what's going on in California right now. The AB 209 money, the Prop 4 money are a very tangible source of risk sharing that we think about when we talk about different projects that are in our portfolio. So I would say, like, deploying that capital, getting it out there is essential, and then also thinking about smart ways to share that risk, especially for some of the larger projects, is something we should unpack.
Rob, anything to add there?
Sure, yeah. I think the state needs to continue to do what it's been doing, right? Project confidence that renewable energy is our future. Offshore wind is part of that portfolio, and the state is going to make it happen, right? The state is going to support whatever it takes to ensure that we make the transition to renewable energy. I often hear this statistic that the state is the fourth or fifth biggest economy in the world if you separate out California from the rest of the nation, which means that we're bigger than Norway, Sweden, Denmark, France, Spain, all of whom are doing offshore wind. So if we have a bigger economy, a larger population, and we're really committed, then we can do it as well. Support from the federal government is important, but right now I think the state needs to project confidence that this is our future. And there's a trick between being in a holding pattern and being ready to spring into action, right? And just because we're in a holding pattern or things are slowing down doesn't mean we shouldn't be ready to spring the opportunity presents itself.
Okay, got it. How about Suzanne, anything to add to those?
Yeah, and I'll just say I am enjoying going third on this panel behind the very smart Rob and Brian to just echo some of those sentiments. I agree. California does need to continue to do what it has been doing, taking those actions on transmission, on procurement, and these port grants. All of those things are steps that do help to de-risk offshore wind in California. To Brian's point, we have been sort of evaluating the whole risk profile even before the change of administration and thinking about how can we attract in private investment into this offshore wind market, which is it's a challenge, I'll be honest with you, because those signals around commitment and the secure source of the revenue doesn't happen until much further out, and we need those investments today. So for us, I would say what we could do with the state is really collaborate on what kind of mechanisms, how can we get creative on de-risking private investment within the time frame that Rob and I need for these really large, long-range development plans where we need those investments really early on. The other thing the state could do is, I'm always in favor of efficient, is it rational or rationalized permitting? And so, really collaborating on those permitting. We heard from Aubrey with the Schatz Energy Center yesterday about how complicated it is. Rob and I are used to this, and so this feels normal to us, but it is complicated. And anything we can do to collaborate on the permitting amongst the state agencies would really help us, and getting permits really is another one of those major milestones that will help de-risk investments.
I wanted to comment on that too. I think that when we look back at what was produced in response to AB 525 and the report there. The permitting and the discussions there were really around projects specifically themselves and projects in the ocean. We didn't go into a lot of detail into permitting the infrastructure on the coast and in communities. The report that we heard from Aubrey, I think, is a very helpful and it's insightful. Also, within the Assembly Bill 3 reports that we're required to do, those won't carry the weight of directing how your permitting has to go with your ports. They're not designed that way, but it is an opportunity, I think, for the state to work with the public and to work with ports to come up with strategies or ways that we can find those efficiencies while also keeping all those necessary protections in place that I think permitting that comes with it. So, Jen, did you have anything to add to that question? I know you're maybe
No.
not thinking about port investments, but
No, yeah, I'm not going to talk about investment.
yeah, that's fair enough. Okay, so want to move on to the next question. Developing offshore wind is, and developing the ports for offshore wind is a very large scale endeavor. And it's really poised to result in a lot of positive economic development in the state and in the communities where it's being built. I wanted to hear from you all on ways that you're thinking about how to maximize those benefits. And I think along those lines also, or if you could comment on how the ports you're working in are engaging communities that are nearby those ports to begin sort of maximizing those benefits as well. So Rob, I think I'll start with you and Suzanne, and then we'll go Brian and Jen.
Thanks. I'm worried I'm going to stumble on this answer because the topic is so important to the Harbor District, and I have so much to say that it's hard to organize my thoughts on it.
Well, I think of the Port of Humboldt as sort of being a pioneer in this space. There weren't a lot of ports that were standing up in the very beginning, and you received some of the first state funding, but had some of the first state ideas. So, yeah, I think you're
Thanks.
okay taking that time.
So I'll start maybe with the most recent grant, the Waterfront Facility Improvement Program grant. So we built into that close to $1 million for tribal capacity building because we're engaging with 7 different tribal governments in this project. And the most common theme we've heard among those 7 tribes is that they don't have the staff capacity to keep up with all of the changes that are going on. They want to be involved, but it is difficult for some of them to dedicate the time and resources. So that feels like a really good step forward to help tribes increase their staff capacity so that they can participate more in offshore wind. And the message we often give is you don't have to support the project to participate. You can go into this and say, we're really skeptical about the project or about offshore wind, but if it's going to happen, then here are some of our expectations. And so that's a really important place to start. To understand how to maximize the benefits of these kinds of projects, I think the first thing you have to do is find the right people. And that takes effort to reach out, make sure people understand what's going on, understand the various parties that could be impacted. So, find, listen, collaborate, and be honest, I think is a really important part of our strategy. And it's only after listening to people that you can understand the best way to benefit them. There's jobs is obvious, right? But Suzanne mentioned the other day that shouldn't be understated, and I think maybe you can speak more to that. But there are so many other potential benefits. The beaches near the project site are constantly eroding for the past several decades. There's an opportunity for us to use the dredge materials from the project to replenish the beaches. I probably should stop because I'm just going to keep going.
Suzanne, did you want to build on that response? And
Yeah, happy to. And similar to Rob, the commitment to our community and prioritizing our community and our development is really important to the Port of Long Beach as well. For offshore wind, we've taken a sort of unique approach. We've set up a new forum specifically to engage a broad range of interested parties. We call it the Zero Roundtable and the Zero Collaborative. And we have leaders from, industry, from trade, from tribes, from education, from elected officials, from environmental justice and community organizations. And the purpose there is that we can gather around the table and share our different perspectives on these important issues with each other. And they also help us create a strategy for the broader outreach and engagement that we need to do here. And that really helps bring in a broad range of perspectives and inputs for us to consider throughout the planning process. So far, it's been a really good forum. We've gotten a lot of good feedback, and we're hoping to continue that and really take it to the next level with the proposed awards under the AB 209 grant with the CEC for an even greater enhancement with our community and environmental justice and tribes organizations to get capacity building in there and really get the word out. I would say what's interesting is I'm always in awe when I go up to Humboldt and you have such a great community gathering around you in support of the project, and there's a lot of focus there within the community. Contrast that to Southern California, and sometimes we struggle to get attention, right? There's a lot of stuff going on there, and so we really need that capacity building so we can get our community organizations out there and get the word out and gather up that feedback. We need a lot of help with that as well. So we are excited about that and helping to share the word about what offshore wind can mean for us as a state on both the environment, the economy, right, with the jobs and, producing that energy that's going to support all of those things.
That's great, and that's a pretty new thing for the Energy Commission to do in grants, which is that capacity building. We put a lot of funding out for a variety of energy topics. Rarely is it for the scale that we're talking about here, and so we'll be working with you as recipients on those on how to implement that capacity building. I think that's really good one. And Brian, if you want to add to that response, because you got something similar going, where you're at.
Yeah, I think very much want to echo what Rob and Suzanne said. For us as a private developer, but really our partnership with the Harbor District, being community-centric in how we design, develop, and eventually construct and operate a project is pretty core to how we approach the whole industry. If we're going to do this, we should do it the right way. If we're going to build a clean energy industry, it doesn't make sense to do it in the wrong way. So that's kind of a core value for us. In our AB 209 grant, we were the Harbor District's O&M terminal was the third largest award. It was in a different category than Suzanne and Rob. We were in kind of the planning category, but we knew we asked for a decent amount of money to progress the project, and we said, hey, it's just the right thing to do to use that same capacity building tool that we're building for the larger projects. We should start to build that muscle today, even though we're in the planning stage. So we actually also voluntarily chose to allocate 10% of our grant, $300,000, to go to stakeholder, tribal, and community stakeholder building. Now, I will say we've seen an upswell of positive support at our community level, and I do want to take a moment to call out folks like the IBEW, Mark Simon and his team, Dave Baldwin from the Pipe Fitters, Slow Climate Coalition, EcoSlow, the Audubon Society, the Surf Riders Foundation. We're seeing this upswell of local organizations who want to address the climate crisis and who want to be a part of the solution and who are saying yes, not at all costs in our backyard, but we are supportive of responsible clean energy development in our backyard, and that's incredibly exciting to see. I think it's really interesting. We build supporting infrastructure, yet we're kind of the tip of the spear when it comes to this industry, so we have to field a lot of those questions around why offshore wind, how many jobs is this whole industry going to create, what does that mean? And I think I don't think transmission developers get the same questions that port developers do in that respect. But I think that's something that I know all of us up on the stage hold dearly, right? And we take that responsibility very seriously, and we want to set a high watermark and set the standard for what good community engagement looks like around offshore wind. So I think it's a great thing, and thank you to the CEC for giving us the opportunity to carve out some money in those grants to give no strings attached to help educate and engage members of our community so that they can have a robust bilateral dialogue about what's going on with our projects and in their communities.
Got it. Suzanne, you wanted to comment?
Well, yeah, and I just wanted to interject a little bit because, you know, we have on the stage 3 different regions and 3 different types of communities we're reaching out to, and how important it is that it's locally driven and responsive to the different communities, because the needs and that engagement looks different in each of the areas. So yeah, kudos to Brian and Rob and for all the efforts you do, and it's going to take that broad range across the state to engage at that local level and be responsive to those community needs.
Yeah, and that was one of the reasons why the grant solicitation presented that opportunity or that requirement that way was so that the state isn't in the middle of those relationships between the communities, because you know your community's best, but still puts us in a place where we can have oversight on how those work, because we've heard how important that is to communities we've engaged with that live near the port. So, Rob, you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, just a quick thought. We have 7 different committees that we meet with on a very regular basis. All of the aquaculture businesses in Humboldt Bay, fishermen is a long list, plus the 7 tribes. 150 different people on these committees. And still every week I meet somebody that knows nothing about offshore wind and is really surprised. And so no matter how much effort we seem to be putting into this, I constantly discover more people that don't know anything and need to be caught up. And you know, that then you're starting the conversation all over about the potential impacts, the potential benefits, the reasons. And so looking at what this offshore wind cluster can do for California seems to be an endless conversation. Just more and more people need to be brought into the conversation.
And you can send them to the YouTube video that you did, like, and I'll say that to make a joke. Like, I think your video is very, it's very reachable for people. So yeah.
Maybe we could also just shout out, we represent a handful of the ports who are working on offshore wind. I know Port of San Francisco is doing some great community engagement and great engineering and thoughtful work. San Diego, Crescent City, Stockton, there's Richmond. There's a whole suite of Oakland ports who are getting into this game, and I think we've all locked arms in terms of committing to doing it the right way with the right amount of community engagement.
Right. Yeah, and we hear a lot of multi-port strategy. We hear a lot about multiple uses at ports to be able to use the investments across different uses. And I'm also hearing it's also very multi-pronged at each port, and some of those prongs you have in common, but they're still tailored to your local conditions. So, and Jen, you're designing and engineering these things and probably doing less of the direct community work, but would love to hear how you think about that in the work you do.
Yeah, maybe I'll speak a little bit also more as just like a general community member. And I remember like even just talking to someone within my company, and they're like, "Oh, so the turbines aren't at the port?" And I'm like, "Oh man, no." So and the ports are at the forefront of, especially the ports that are away from the direct lease areas. Those communities might not have heard about potential offshore wind opportunities in California, and so the ports are kind of the first, are at the forefront of community engagement and being able to reach out to the surrounding communities that are going to support offshore wind. So I think it's important that a lot of community outreach is done, and also just kind of, even though the projects are not tomorrow, but a little bit in the future, it's important to just get the word out and then let the communities know that there are opportunities for a workforce and for community benefits. And I think AB 209 saying that a portion of the grant has to go towards community building and tribal engagement is amazing, because it shows, right, that the state has listened to the past feedback that's been received and is working to improve that. So, yeah.
Well, thanks for that. And Rob, somewhere in there, I really enjoyed hearing that you're thinking about your project in terms of the place that you want to create with that project. And it's, I think you had a comment about being able to improve beaches with dredge and fill. So it's always fascinating to hear those things, like how you can think about a project that way. Okay, I want to move quickly to an AB3 question that I have. And so, again, save the date, June 18th. Official workshop notice will be posted shortly, but that is going to be a workshop we do to kick off the AB3 process. And Jen, I think I'll really direct this to you because you've done so much work in this space, both at the port level and supporting state work. But AB3 is really this opportunity to advance what we understand about ports and being ready. What are, from your perspective, some of the major questions that still need to be answered in that process?
Yeah, and I think AB3 is a good build on to the AB 525 strategic plan that just came out last year. And, in the first AB 525 port readiness plan, we identified a number of ports that could be used as part of this multi-port strategy and really focused on, if everything was to be built in California, right, if all the blades, the nacelles, the tower sections were to be built within California, it would require something like 17 different port sites, which is a lot. But we really wanted to, for this next phase, really hone in on, okay, what does 50% in state assembly look like? How many ports are needed for that, We don't necessarily need 17 different port sites. And then in addition to 50%, what does 65% look like? So kind of honing in and focusing on some of those different manufacturing ports and identifying which ports or how many are needed for that. Just because a lot of, the ports have done a lot of work at looking at manufacturing. Like Port of San Francisco did a concept study that was released late 2023. And then now Port of Richmond and Port of Oakland get the opportunity to look within their ports to support manufacturing. So really kind of focusing on those other port sites is important for the supply chain build out. And then also I think to build on AB 525 is identifying of funding and financing strategies for the ports, just because we know, 475 million is great and an amazing start, but not quite enough to develop these projects. So how can these ports get funding and attract them and have different strategies to build their projects and not just do the engineering or permitting? So I think those are some questions that AB3 should look into and save the date, June 18th.
Is there anything else that you all want to build on in terms of AB3 and some of the questions that we can explore and answer?
I'll just quickly say we each have so much to do independently. It's easy to get myopically focused on our own thing. I'm really glad the state is looking at the bigger picture and bringing the other ports into it. San Francisco, San Diego are going to play such important roles. There's so many of other California ports. And so while we're dedicated and focused on our own projects, we're really rooting for the next step.
I think AB3 was written and passed in a slightly different regime. Like a lot has changed since it was passed, right? We have a different federal regime. We have a different kind of financing ability at the state. We have the chessboard has changed, and I think we also need to recognize that the fastest way to economic development and community impact is actually to deploy projects, to actually have them go out. And we shouldn't undercut the real impact that it's going to have around our ports to be launching a brand new construction industry of a major infrastructure or a set of major infrastructure assets. So let's make sure that we as America didn't do the crawl, walk, run in terms of project size. We went straight to the run in terms of the size of the projects we're looking to build. Perhaps we need to be humble and also take a realistic view about how much supply chain we should be focused on first and what does success look like. I know some OEMs had been talking about deployment is success at the beginning, as much as a couple of years ago. I don't think enough of us were listening to that. I think we really should ground ourselves in, let's get projects in the water, steel in the water, people to work, and then let that be the base, the platform that earns us the right to pull in more manufacturing, right? Assembly makes a ton of sense, integration makes a ton of sense, but the most important thing is, let's get to deployment.
Right. And AB3 is results and reports to be delivered to the legislature and the governor. So they are to inform that decision-making process, but they're not to set a particular policy on like a in-state content requirement or something like that. And Jen, thanks for pointing out that the 525 reports set a big planning goal in that process, and then the analysis was if all of this was done in California, because that's helpful as we go in and, like you said, look at 50 and 65%, because we know what it looks like, to maximize that. So, and we got a audience question that came through, and we don't have much time left. So, the question is there an understanding of ultimately what split of public versus private investment is likely needed for the major port infrastructure upgrade projects? I don't know if that's one, Brian, you want to take with a lot of your experience with financing ports on the East Coast. Rob and Suzanne, I'm sure you've thought about this and looked into it, but you want to go for it, Brian?
It's all about risk, right? The private dollars will accept some risk, but ultimately we want to put our money into projects where there's a pathway to get a long-term return, right? So in some projects like O&M, there are long-term contracts that will allow us at some point to sign a lease for 25 years. Those projects are more easily privately financed, right? Projects like the ones that Rob and Suzanne are looking at have much less revenue certainty. I think I've said this before. We don't expect an offshore wind developer to build a $5 billion offshore wind project without 25 years of contracted offtake. Yet we look at ports, the major staging integration ones, and ask them to build a $1, $2, $3, $5 billion project with zero offtake. We have to find creative ways in those sorts of projects to fund them either with public dollars or to use public dollars in a smart way to crowd in more private finance. And I know this is a topic that's near and dear to Suzanne's heart, but looking at things like a revenue backstop. So what happens if there's no offshore wind that has nothing to do with the ports? It didn't happen this year. What happens to the port developer or the port, or a debt backstop, which would be, we can't get lending for any of our projects, which we want to get lending into these projects because it reduces the cost of capital, which reduces the cost to ratepayers. We want cheap money in these projects, building them. We can't get that unless our banks feel comfortable that they're going to get repaid. So is there a way that the state can come in and help guarantee a portion of that debt service for especially the larger staging integration projects that will allow folks like Clean Energy Terminals to say, we're comfortable with the risk-reward profile of that project. Here's a big chunk of money.
And you concur, and you concur, and you concur, and then we're...
Yeah, I mean, how can you follow Brian on something like that? So yeah, just to concur with what Brian said, and to say that it is going to be a mix of public and private funding. Certainly the ports funding is part of that mix, the state's funding, and the phasing in which that funding comes online is going to be important as well, because the public money also helps de-risk the private investment. And so things like the climate bond are extremely, extremely important as we look to build out that stack.
Rob, go for it.
Just quickly, will it take public and private investment? Yes. Do we know the ratio currently? No. But I would love for us to be able to sit down with a panel of the top experts at the state government and figure out new strategies, right? Can California invent something that's never been done before and a way to make this work? I believe in the power of California to come up with something that'll be new and innovative.
Right. That sounds like a great idea, actually.
The gauntlet is thrown. Next year, we have a conversation at this conference talking about how does the revenue backstop or debt backstop work. That would be a game changer for port development in California and truthfully across the country.
Right. Okay, perfect. Thank you all. We appreciate it. And I think our time is up.